Imagine settling into a house with the past so haunting, no one dares to talk about it. This is the true story of those who uncovered a horrifying secret beneath their feet. By the end of this video, you'll be left questioning the terrifying realities hidden in our world. You ever wonder what makes a house feel off? Not the broken windows or peeling paint, not the dust settling over forgotten furniture, something deeper, something you can't see, but you can feel. That's what Daniel and Olivia Carter thought when they moved into their new home, a century-old Victorian masterpiece, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where no one made eye contact for too long, a house that looked perfect on the surface. But houses like these, they never come without a past. The previous owner, gone, not moved away, not passed on, just gone, left everything behind like he meant to come back, but never did. A toothbrush still in the bathroom, a jacket draped over the chair, a cup of coffee dried to the bottom of the mug, like time stopped for him but kept going for everyone else. And the neighbors? They wouldn't talk. A polite smile, a quick nod, and then a door shutting before Olivia could even ask a question. That should have been the first sign. At first glance, the house was beautiful. High ceilings, wide hallways, that old charm people pay good money for. But beauty can be deceiving, because the moment they stepped inside, the air felt different. Creaking floors that groaned under their feet, like someone else was walking just behind them. A faint whisper in the walls, never clear enough to understand, but always just loud enough to notice. Cold spots in the hallway that left Olivia with chills deep enough to make her arms prickle. But the strangest thing, the floors. They were perfect. Polished wood, no scratches, no dents. Like the past had never touched them, except for one spot, one stain, right in the center of the living room. It was dark, uneven. It bled into the cracks of the wood like it had been there for years. Olivia tried everything, soap, bleach, scrubbing until her fingers ached. But the stain wouldn't budge. And at night, it looked darker, like it was wet. She told Daniel it made her uneasy. He laughed, kissed her on the forehead, said it was probably just an old water stain. But deep down, she knew better. Because stains fade. Stains disappear over time. This one, it only seemed to grow. At first, it was little things. The kind of stuff you could blame on a draft, an old house settling, or maybe just a tired mind playing tricks. Olivia would be in the kitchen, washing dishes, and she'd see it, something shifting at the edge of her vision. A shadow, quick and silent, disappearing the second she turned her head. At night, when the house should have been still, she heard it. Faint footsteps coming from the hallway, too light to be Daniel's, too deliberate to be the wind. Daniel didn't believe her. He laughed it off, saying old houses always creaked, always made noise, but Olivia wasn't convinced. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Their dog, always playful, always curious, refused to enter the living room, stood frozen at the doorway, ears flat, eyes locked on the floor, a low, warning growl rumbling in his chest. He saw something. Olivia tried pulling him in, but the moment she tugged the leash, he yelped and pulled back, so hard she nearly lost her grip. He wouldn't even step past the threshold, wouldn't even look at the stain. And the longer they lived there, the darker that stain seemed to get. One night, Olivia woke to a sound downstairs, not the usual creaks, not the wind rattling the windows, something deliberate. A soft, wet dripping. She glanced at Daniel, fast asleep. She should have stayed in bed, should have pulled the blankets over her head and ignored it. But something about that sound called to her. Slowly, she slipped out from under the covers, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and stepped into the hallway. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Each step down the stairs groaned beneath her weight. The living room was dark, the air was cold, and there it was. The stain stretched out across the floor, but this time it looked wet. She swallowed hard, stepping closer. The flashlight beam wobbled as she crouched down. The stain was glistening, fresh. Her fingers hovered over it, just an inch away. Then footsteps. Fast, rushing toward her. She whipped around just as a figure lunged from the hallway, a blur of darkness, too fast to see, but close enough to feel. A sharp gasp caught in her throat. The flashlight slipped from her hands, rolling across the floor as she stumbled back. Then nothing. Silence. The figure was gone. The only sound left was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Sleep should have been an escape, a break from the strange things happening inside the house. But for Olivia, it became something else. The first dream was so real, she woke up gasping for air. She was standing in the living room, the house dark and silent, the stain stretched across the floor, but this time, it wasn't just a stain. It moved. The wood pulsed like something was shifting underneath. Then a hand, thin, pale, burst through the floorboards, fingers clawing, nails broken and bloody. Another hand followed. Then a face. A man, mouth open in a scream, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide, desperate, staring straight at her as if begging. She tried to move, tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't listen. She was stuck, frozen in place as more hands reached up, pulling at her ankles, dragging her closer. Then she woke up, heart hammering, sweat dripping down her back. Daniel was still asleep beside her, breathing steady, unaware of the nightmare lingering in the dark. She wanted to tell him, but she already knew what he'd say. It's just stress, just the house getting to you. But Daniel wasn't as untouched as he thought. It started small. He'd find himself standing in the kitchen, unsure of why he'd gone in there. A misplaced set of keys, a coffee cup left in the wrong room. Then, one morning, he woke up on the basement floor. He didn't remember going down there, didn't remember laying on the cold cement. His hands were dirty, fingernails packed with dust. That's when Olivia told him about the dreams. And for the first time, Daniel listened. Later that night, they went into the basement together. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the stone walls. That's when they found it. A crawl space hidden behind old shelves. The opening was small, just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, boxes, dust-covered, forgotten. Inside them, pieces of the past. A wedding ring still in its case, a child's shoe, letters written in faded ink, and photos. Black and white portraits of families standing in front of the house. Each picture taken years apart, decades between them. But the house was always the same. And the families? Not one of them looked happy. A tightness settled in Olivia's chest. She knew what this meant. They needed answers. The next morning, they called a local historian, someone who knew the town, knew the house. And he did too well. His voice was low over the phone. Careful. Said every family that ever lived there faced tragedy. A woman found hanging in the attic. A child who vanished without a trace. A father who walked into the basement one night and never came back. Some were called accidents, others unexplained. But the truth was clear. No one left that house unbroken. That night, Olivia refused to sleep. She sat in the living room, eyes locked on the stain, watching, waiting. Daniel set up a security camera just to prove nothing was there. At 3 a.m, the motion sensor went off. The camera started recording. The next morning, they checked the footage. There it was, a figure, standing in the middle of the room, motionless. Not moving, not blinking, just staring at the stain. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He rewound the footage, played it again. The figure never moved, never turned away, just stood there, and then it was gone, like it had never been there at all. Daniel came home late. The house was dark, silent, no sound of the television, no footsteps moving upstairs. Then he saw her, Olivia, sitting on the living room floor, staring at the stain, eyes wide, empty. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. He's still down there. Daniel's stomach tightened. She didn't blink, didn't even look up when he stepped closer. The stain, it wasn't the same. It had spread, crawling outward, bleeding into the hallway, the dark wood swallowed by something thicker, something alive. Daniel reached for Olivia, but she flinched, like she didn't recognize him. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her hands trembled. Then she whispered something else. "I saw him." Daniel's pulse pounded. "Saw who?" She finally looked at him, eyes hollow, face pale, the man in the floor. She didn't need to explain. Daniel had seen enough, felt enough, to know that whatever was happening, it was getting worse. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. "I saw what happened to him." Her voice shook as she spoke. The vision had come fast, like falling into a memory that didn't belong to her. The house had looked different, brighter. The wallpaper new, the furniture elegant, untouched by time. A man was in the living room, a suit pressed, a cigarette burning between his fingers. The radio hummed softly in the background. Then a noise. Heavy footsteps, a door slamming. The man barely had time to turn before hands grabbed him, dragged him across the floor. He kicked, thrashed, gasped for air, but the grip didn't loosen. His head slammed against the floor. Once, twice, a crack. Blood seeped from his skull, pooling beneath him, sinking into the wood. The stain, the one Olivia had scrubbed over and over. It had started right there. It had never been a stain. It was a man's last breath. Olivia snapped out of the vision, gasping, heart pounding in her chest, the room around her blurred, tilting, spinning. Then a noise, a creak beneath her. She looked down. The floor moved. The boards shifted, bending, splitting apart. And then a hand shot through the wood, cold, twisted, fingers curling around her ankle. Her scream tore through the house. She kicked, scrambled backward, her heels slamming against the floor as she tried to break free. The hand tightened, pulling, dragging. Her breath hitched, panic clawing at her throat. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The floor was whole again. Not a single crack, not a splinter out of place, but the stain? It was bigger now, and no matter what they did, it wouldn't go away. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the cold spots, the stain that kept spreading. Olivia waking up with bruises on her ankles. Finger-shaped bruises. Something was beneath the floor. Something was still there. He grabbed a crowbar, knelt over the stain, and jammed it between the floorboards. Olivia stood behind him, silent, watching. With a sharp pull, the wood cracked open. Dust rose into the air. The scent of earth and rot spilled out, thick enough to choke on. Daniel pried another board loose, then another. That's when they saw it. A trap door, right beneath the stain, hidden all this time, waiting to be found. Daniel hesitated. His fingers hovered over the rusted latch. His heart pounded, screaming at him to stop. But it was too late to stop now. The latch gave with a groan. The door swung open. The air that rushed up was cold, heavy. It carried something more than dust, something wrong. Daniel lifted the flashlight, shining it into the darkness below. Then Olivia gasped. Bones, stacked neatly, row after row. Skulls grinning up at them. Some small, some large, some still wrapped in scraps of decayed fabric. Not one, not two, dozens, buried beneath their feet this whole time. Olivia covered her mouth, her breath ragged. Daniel swallowed the bile rising in his throat. Then something caught his eye. A small wooden box tucked between the remains, dust-covered, sealed shut. His hands shook as he reached for it. The wood crumbled beneath his fingers, but inside, something perfectly preserved. A letter. Yellowed, fragile, dated 1897. Daniel's lips parted as he read the words, scrawled in ink that had barely faded. They are not dead. His grip tightened. They are waiting. Then a sound, a brittle, hollow clatter. Daniel froze. The flashlight wobbled in his grip. The bones, they were moving, shifting, rearranging, spines bending the wrong way, fingers twitching, cracking back into place. A skull rolled toward Olivia's feet, stopped, then lifted off the ground as if something unseen was pulling the strings. Daniel dropped the letter. Then they crawled, bones scraping against stone, hands stretching forward, teeth chattering together in a sound that wasn't human. Something whispered from the dark. Not one voice, many. They were not dead. They had been waiting. Daniel grabbed Olivia's hand. His grip was tight, ice cold. "We need to go, now." They ran. The front door was just a few steps away. Olivia reached for the handle, locked. She yanked, pulled with everything she had. Nothing! Daniel spun toward the windows, slammed his fist against the glass, unbreakable. The house would not let them leave. Then the sound, deep, hollow, rising from beneath them. A scream. Not one voice, many. The walls shook, the ceiling groaned, dust spilling from the cracks. The floorboards buckled beneath their feet. And then they rose. Figures, twisted, crawling, grinning. Their bodies were wrong, limbs bending at angles they shouldn't, mouths stretched too wide. Daniel stumbled back, his breath sharp, his fingers digging into his temples. "I see them now," he whispered. His knees gave out. His body hit the floor. Olivia dropped beside him. "Daniel, get up!" But he didn't move. The stain, it was growing, bleeding outward, stretching across the wood, swallowing him whole. His body sank, pulled down inch by inch. His hands clawed at the floor, but the wood melted beneath his fingers. "Olivia!" His voice cracked. His eyes were wide, locked onto hers, begging. Then he was gone. The floor sealed shut, smooth, untouched. Like he had never been there at all. Olivia's scream shattered the silence. She grabbed a chair, smashed it against the walls. The wood splintered, but the house stood strong. She flipped the table, threw books, ripped curtains from the windows. Nothing. She grabbed the lamp, its light flickering in her shaking hands, and set the room on fire. Flames licked the wallpaper, crawled up the walls. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. But the house? Untouched. The fire did not spread. The smoke did not rise. The house stood still, watching, waiting. And Olivia? She was trapped inside it. The police arrived 2 days later. A missing persons report. A worried co-worker. A phone call that no one answered. They knocked. No response. The door was unlocked. Inside the house was silent. No sign of a struggle. No fire damage. And Olivia? She was sitting in the middle of the living room, motionless, staring at the floor. Her lips barely moved, her voice a whisper thin as air. "He's still down there." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The floor beneath her was clean. No stain, no sign of anything ever being wrong. Just polished wood, smooth and untouched. Daniel was nowhere. They searched every room, every hallway, the basement. Nothing. It was as if he had never existed. The official report would call it a disappearance, a tragedy with no answers. But Olivia knew the truth. The house had taken him, just like the ones before, just like the ones that would come next. Weeks passed. The house went up for sale. A fresh coat of paint, a new set of furniture, and another family moved in. A young couple, excited, ready to start fresh. Their son, no older than 5, ran across the living room laughing. He stopped, dropped to his knees, tapped his little fingers against the floor, a pause, then a faint knock from underneath. The boy giggled, tapped again, another knock. Louder this time. The parents smiled, thought nothing of it. The house had been waiting. And now, the cycle would begin again.